If you're watching from a video, we have a tiny group here. We always have a tiny group, but we have a really tiny group here tonight. But we decided to go forward with teaching, and it's a lesson that I'm very excited to study for and to teach. And everything I'm about to say is suspect. So everything I'm about to say, you can just, when I'm done, you can toss it out and say, nah, I don't believe that. But before I get into the lesson, I need to tell you a quick story. About 8 or 10 years ago, I was in Prescott Valley, Arizona, and I was teaching a seminar, and I spent the night with a bishop there, and he and I sat out on his porch in the evening and had a drink and a cigar together, and we were just talking. And this is the first time I had really met him, and we were just talking, and I don't know how it came up, but the subject of my lesson tonight came up, and we started talking, and he started listening, and I said to him what I just said to you: if this doesn't make sense, just forget about it. If you don't want to, there's nothing lost if you completely reject this. And then we talked. The next morning I got up for breakfast with him at his house, and he walked out of his room, and he said, I couldn't sleep all night thinking about what you said. And I said, well, I don't know if there's anything to it or not. Well, absolutely there is. It's the fact. It's the truth. It has to be what you just said. And I said, no, it doesn't have to be, but I think it is. So, with that preface in mind, let's begin. We looked last week at Matthew, Mark, Luke. Tonight we're going to look at the Gospel of John. We looked at the sources and, some of the simple background of those three Gospels that are called the synoptic, with the same eye, seeing the same thing Gospels. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are very, very similar. John is completely different. And we saw that Matthew, if you will, is James's gospel. James was the bishop of Jerusalem. Matthew was a tax collector and Jewish and of Jerusalem and close to James. And in fact, there have been volumes written on how the epistle of James and the gospel of Matthew dovetail. Matthew is James's gospel, if you will. Mark is Peter's gospel. Peter's influence is all over that gospel. Luke is Paul's gospel. Paul was a missionary into the Gentile world. Luke was a Gentile converted under Paul, and Luke was a researcher and an interviewer, and he compiled his gospel and the book of Acts, and it's got Paul's fingerprints all over it. What about John? Well, some people will say John was written by John, by the Apostle John, and that it is John's gospel, that he himself is the source for this gospel. And that may be, but I don't think so, and I want to share tonight why and who. Where does the information and the style of the Gospel of John come from? John, we know this. John was an uneducated fisherman from Galilee. Galilee is in the north. It's to the north of Jerusalem, and it is... The people of Jerusalem looked at the people of Galilee as if they were country bumpkins, as if they were hillbillies. And the people of Galilee had a reputation for being uneducated. They're the ones that talked with a southern accent, if you will, although they were from the north. And before being called by Jesus to follow him, John and his brother James, sons of Zebedee, were fishermen. They spent their lives on the Sea of Galilee fishing. John chapter 1, verse 45. Philip found Nathanael and told him, "We have found the one Moses wrote about in the law, about whom the prophets also wrote, Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph." Philip's going and telling his friend Nathanael. Nathanael responded, "Nazareth? Can anything good come from Nazareth?" Nazareth was in Galilee. That's the reputation Galilee had in the Israeli world. When Peter and John, in the book of Acts, when Peter and John were called to testify before the Sanhedrin, the Supreme Court of Israel, chapter 4, this is what it says. When they, the Sanhedrin, when they saw the courage of Peter and John and realized that they were unschooled, ordinary men, they were astonished, and they took note that these men had been with Jesus. That the leaders, the political and spiritual leaders of Israel, were astonished at Peter and John because they saw them as unschooled, ordinary men. So here we have John, the follower of Jesus, disciple of Jesus, writing the most complex, insightful, mystical, theological, spiritual of all the four Gospels. And as he writes this, he lays hold of profound, by that I mean deep, profound Greek and Jewish theology. What in the world is a fisherman doing with this material? How does an unschooled, ordinary man from the backwaters of Israel write a gospel in a Greek that is superior to Matthew, Mark, and Luke's Greek? How does he know so much about the intricacies of the feasts and festivals in Jerusalem? How does he know so much about temple worship? The Gospel of John is structured around temple worship and the feasts. How does he incorporate the deep philosophy and theology of the Jewish theologian Philo, who is from Alexandria, Egypt, and who was the most intellectual rabbi of his time? And how does this fisherman incorporate this in the beginning of his gospel when he talks? He starts by talking about the Logos. That's Philo's words. How does John, the fisherman, even know about this? Here's my short answer. I could be totally wrong. My short answer is that just like Matthew wasn't the source of Matthew, Luke wasn't the source of Luke, Mark wasn't the source of Mark, I want to throw out to you that John wasn't the source of the Gospel of John. He may have had a hand in writing it, but the material belongs to someone else. To whom? Let's talk about that. In the Gospel of John, and in none of the other Gospels, we find this character who is a brother to Mary and Martha. Mary and Martha were upper crust ladies in Jerusalem. They lived in the ritzy suburb of Jerusalem called Bethany. It's where the high priest family lived. It's where the intelligentsia and the leaders and the community leaders lived. It's where the rich folk lived. And Mary and Martha and their brother Lazarus lived there as well. By the way, Lazarus is how we say it in the Bible and in Greek. The Hebrew is Eleazar. In the book of John, chapter 11, Lazarus is sick. And they come to Jesus in verse 3, and they say, "Lord, he whom you love is ill." Verse 5, now Jesus loved Mary and Martha and Lazarus. Jesus loved them. Lazarus dies. Jesus goes to the tomb, and the shortest verse in the Bible that you all memorized as kids is found in that story. Jesus wept. He sat by the tomb and he cried because his friend Lazarus had died. And in verse 36, the people said, "See how he loved him." Jesus loved Lazarus. Jesus loves everybody, but Jesus loved Lazarus. So Jesus tells the people to roll away the stone from Lazarus' tomb. And when he said this, he called out in a loud voice, verse 43, "Lazarus, come out." And the dead man came out, his hands and feet wrapped with strips of linen and a cloth around his face. And Jesus said to them, "Take off the grave clothes and let him go." The next time we see Lazarus is in the next chapter, chapter 12 of John, verse 1. 6 days before the Passover, Jesus came to Bethany, where Lazarus lived, whom Jesus had raised from the dead. Here a dinner was given in Jesus' honor. I want you to listen to this language. Martha served, while Lazarus was among those reclining at the table with him. This is not the Last Supper. This is just a dinner party. But Lazarus, along with disciples, is reclining at the table with Jesus. Same chapter. Meanwhile, a large crowd of Jews found out that Jesus was there and came not only because of him, but to see Lazarus, whom he had raised from the dead. Lazarus is a star now. Verse 10. So the chief priest made plans to kill Lazarus as well as Jesus. For on account of him, many of the Jews were going over to Jesus and believing in him. Continuing, same chapter, verse 17. Now the crowd that was with him when he called Lazarus from the tomb and raised him from the dead continued to spread the word. Many people, because they had heard that he had performed this sign, went out to meet him. So the Pharisees said to one another, "See, this is getting us nowhere. Look how the whole world has gone after him." So Lazarus is now a man, we could say, with a price on his head. He's a superstar. Everybody knows about the resurrection. People are coming out to see him. They're as interested in seeing him as they are in seeing Jesus. He's causing a ruckus. There's a price on his head. They are plotting on how to kill this man as well as to kill Jesus. And this is the last mention of Lazarus in the Bible. It's the last mention of Lazarus in the Gospel of John. John chapter 12, where we're told that there's a price on his head. That's the last time we hear anything from Lazarus. It is almost as if he's gone undercover. He's gone into hiding. Maybe he's taken a different name, an alias. Maybe he's got a nickname. He disappears from the scene. And as soon as he disappears from the scene, another figure shows up. A character that has not been in John at all up until now. A character that is not mentioned in any of the other Gospels, not mentioned anywhere else in the Bible. There's this new character. Chapter 12, Lazarus, gone. Chapter 13, this new character. Verse 23 of chapter 13. One of his disciples, now listen. One of his disciples, whom Jesus loved, was reclining at table at Jesus' side. This is describing the Last Supper. And there's this character, there's this disciple, unnamed, but we've got a code name, whom Jesus loved. And what's the first thing we hear about him? He's reclining at the table with Jesus. That's the last thing we heard about Lazarus, whom Jesus loved, at the dinner party reclining with Jesus. So Jesus gets arrested, and Jesus is put on trial, and he's taken back and forth from this place to this place. He's taken to the high priest's house in the middle of the night, to the high priest's house. You all know the story of Peter sitting by the fire, betraying Jesus 3 times. Well, where that happened was outside the high priest's house. Cool evening, there's a fire, he's standing out there. But listen to what John 18 says, verse 15. Simon Peter and another disciple. Who? Well, we just don't know his name. Well, why don't we know his name? Was it Andrew? Was it Nathaniel? Was it Matthew? Leave it at that. Simon Peter and another disciple were following Jesus. Now, if you read a lot of the commentaries, they all say this is John. They all say the disciple whom Jesus loved is John. But watch what happens. Because this disciple was known to the high priest, he went with Jesus into the high priest's court. But Peter had to wait outside the door. Now just reason with me for a minute. What was Peter before he was a follower of Jesus? A Galilean fisherman. What was James, the brother of John? A Galilean fisherman. What was John? A Galilean fisherman. If the disciple whom Jesus loved was John, how in the world was he known to the high priest and was able to enter into the courtyard at the high priest's house while Peter had to wait outside? Let me read it to you again. Simon Peter and another disciple were following Jesus. Because this disciple was known to the high priest, he went with Jesus into the high priest's courtyard. But Peter had to wait outside the door. The other disciple, who was known to the high priest, came back, spoke to the servant girl on duty there, and brought Peter in. Whoever this is, he's moving in high places. He knows people in Bethany, and people in Bethany know him. The high priest knows him. I don't think it's a fisherman from Galilee. So, Jesus is sentenced to death. Jesus is crucified. Jesus is on the cross, and all of his disciples, the scriptures say, have forsaken him. All the apostles ran, abandoned him. And so who's still there at the foot of the cross? Jesus' mother, Mary, a few other women, and lo and behold, the disciple whom Jesus loved. 19:26. When Jesus saw his mother and the disciple whom he loved standing nearby, he said to his mother, "Woman, behold your son." And he said to the disciple, "Behold your mother." He's entrusting the care of his mother to this man, to this disciple whom he loved. If this was John, he's about to send John to be a missionary along with the others. Go you into all the world and make disciples of the nations. He's about to send them out to die, to spread the gospel all over. Why would he entrust his mother to the care of this missionary who's about to go off into dangerous places? What if instead this disciple whom he loved, who was known by the high priest, who reclined with him at dinner, what if that is someone from Bethany and well-to-do and has a couple of sisters who can also help take care of mom. So Jesus dies. He's crucified. He's buried. Chapter 20 of John. Now on the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene came to the tomb early, while it was still dark. And she saw that the stone had been taken away from the tomb. And she ran and went to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one whom Jesus loved, and said to them, "They have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we do not know where they have laid him." Now listen to what happens. So Peter went out with the other disciple, and they were going to the tomb. And both of them were running together. But the other disciple outran Peter and reached the tomb first. I want you to pay close attention to this. Peter and the other disciple running to the tomb as fast as they can. The other disciple, the disciple whom Jesus loved, gets there first and reached the tomb first. And stooping to look in, he saw the linen cloths lying there, but he did not go in. Why? If the other disciple is John, why not run right in? If the other disciple is Lazarus, think about it. He's running and he comes to a tomb and he stops short. Been there, done that. I'm not going in there. He's sort of arrested in the moment. Then Simon Peter came following him and went into the tomb. And he saw the linen cloths lying there, and the face cloth, which had been on Jesus' head, not lying with the linen cloths, but folded up in a place by itself. Then the other disciple, who had reached the tomb first, also went in, and he saw and believed. For as yet they did not understand the scriptures, that he must rise from the dead. Then the disciples went back to their homes. Two more passages from John. After the resurrection, they've all seen Jesus, or they've all seen at least that he's risen. And in chapter 21, they're back up in Galilee, and Jesus appeared. It happened this way, the scripture says. Simon Peter, Thomas, Nathanael, sons of Zebedee. Who are the sons of Zebedee? James and John. And two other disciples were together. "I'm going out to fish," Simon told them, and they said, "We'll go with you." So they went and got in the boat, but that night they caught nothing. Early the next morning, Jesus stood on the shore, but the disciples did not realize it was Jesus. And he called out to them, "Friends, have you caught any fish?" "No," they answered. He said, "Throw your net on the right side of the boat and you will find some." When they did, they were unable to haul the net in because of the large number of fish. And then the disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, "It's the Lord." This story just mentioned the sons of Zebedee and two other disciples. If it were John who said it's the Lord, why didn't it say, "and one of the sons of Zebedee"? But it says the disciple whom Jesus loved said it is the Lord. Last text. John chapter 21. They're on the seashore having fish sandwiches. Peter turned and saw the disciple whom Jesus loved following them. the one who also had leaned back against him during the supper and had said, Lord, who is it that is going to betray you? When Peter saw him, he said to Jesus, Lord, what about this man? Because you see, Jesus had just told Peter he was going to die. He had just told Peter, in fact, we read that a couple of weeks ago as a gospel lesson. He had just told Peter that when you're young, you could go where you want to, but when you're older, you're going to be bound and you're going to be carried places you don't want to go. And the scripture says, he said this in reference to how Peter dies. So he's just said, Peter, you're going to die. And then Peter sees the disciple whom Jesus loved walking, and he says, Lord, what about this man? Now, I'm almost finished, but you've got to pay attention to this. You've got to think about this. Jesus said to him, if it is my will that he remain until I come, what is that to you? You follow me. So the saying spread among the brothers that this disciple was not to die. Yet Jesus did not say to him that he was not to die, but if it's my will that he remain until I come, what is that to you? Here's my question. Why in the world would the rumor start among the brothers, among the other disciples, that this guy's not going to die? We think maybe what Jesus meant was he's not going to die, because he said to Peter, if it's my will for him to live until I return, what's it to you? I don't think he's going to die. I think he's going to live until Jesus comes back. Why would they say such a thing if it were John or if it were anybody else? But it makes perfect sense for them to say that if it's Lazarus, because he's already died and already been risen. So let me conclude. End of chapter 21. Whoever is writing the Gospel of John is not the source of the Gospel of John. Who wrote the Gospel of John? I mean, who took a pen and wrote it? Maybe John. Maybe some people in John's community. It is Johannine somehow. But he's not the source. The text itself ends by saying the writer is not the source. Listen. Chapter 21, verse 24. So the saying spread among the brothers that this disciple was not to die, yet Jesus did not say to him he was not to die, but if it is my will that he remain until I come, what is that to you? Very next verse. This is the disciple who is bearing witness about all these things. In other words, he's our source. All these things that we've told you about, we got it from this disciple. This is the disciple who is bearing witness about these things, who has written these things, and we know that his testimony is true. I propose to you to at least entertain the idea that the beloved disciple is the disciple that Jesus loved and that the text says he loved, Lazarus. He would have been from the upper crust of Jerusalem culture. He would have been educated. He would have known Greek. He could have learned complex theology. He would have known Jerusalem. He would have known the feast. He would have known the temple worship. And he would have known Jesus as a close and dear friend. So, whereas other gospels, when they talk about his genealogy, they start with Abraham because he's a Jew. Or Luke goes all the way back to Adam because he's a human. Mark doesn't go back anywhere because he's a servant. But John is portraying Jesus as God. So he doesn't start the genealogy with Abraham or even with Adam. He goes back to the very beginning. And he says, in the beginning was the Word. and the Word was with... Wait a minute. Where did John, or whoever wrote this, get this idea of the Logos? That's Greek philosophy and deep Jewish theology from Philo of Alexandria. How did the fisherman John know this? I don't think he did. I think Lazarus did. And he starts his book by saying, in the beginning was the Logos. And every Jewish reader of learning and every Greek philosopher reading it goes, whoa, what? In the beginning was the Logos. Well, of course, we all agree on that. Jews and Greeks alike. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Makes sense to the Greeks, makes sense to the Hebrews. And then in verse 14, this bomb gets dropped. And he says, and the Word became flesh and lived among us. This is how far back John goes, to the beginning. And he portrays Jesus not just as man, not just as servant, not just as Jew. He portrays him as God come in the flesh. I think it was Lazarus. You think about that. Amen.